Today's big question is about the assisted dying legislation and looking at a Christian perspective on that, which really is more a Christian conversation around that. For some people, it's a topic that you don't want to look at, and we would understand that. For others, it might be a conversation that raises all sorts of big questions for you. If you're someone that would prefer not to watch today's big question conversation, please turn off now. If you're someone that actually this triggers some issues for you, remember you can give me a call anytime, or you could call Lifeline and talk to Lifeline. But here's today's big question.
Well, g'day everyone. As we continue on exploring some of the big questions that people have put forward in our congregation, one of the interesting things for me is that our big questions, we've actually kept them so that we don't know any of the names of who will put the questions up. So it could be any of you in the congregation that have asked these. Today, I'm going to be talking with Simon Hansford. Hello, Simon.
Richard, how you doing, mate?
Not too bad. Simon is the moderator of the Uniting Church in the New South Wales and ACT. Now, a moderator is a bit like a bishop without a funny hat, I think would be a good description of him. So he's the leader at this point in time. Although we've just elected a new one, Marta, which will be very exciting for Marta to follow in after you in 18 months' time.
Indeed. She'll do a fantastic job.
She will. Now, Simon, I'm going to be giving you one of the trickier questions of our big questions.
Yep.
Someone has asked this one, and that is, as more states consider assisted dying legislation, what is the Christian response? Yes, and I'm really pleased that you're here doing this so that I can hide.
Yes, just blank your screen now, Rich.
Yeah. The assisted dying legislation is a really challenging one for us.
Yeah.
How do we as Christians respond to this one?
Well, I think it's really interesting. The question's fantastic because it's a really relevant question for a number of reasons. One of which is we've actually had the conversation just recently at Synod, and we tried to converse around it rather than resolve it in terms of having a position, but just to work some things through, and that's been really important too. But also there's been a legislation suggestion being brought forward to the state parliament coming up, I think, in September or October. I'm not too sure how far it'll get or what will happen to it, but so it's a very current conversation, right?
Yeah. Well, look, I know it's interesting because I have talked to not all of the doctors in my congregation, but a couple of the doctors in my congregation. And I actually get both sides of the debate, even from the GPs that we have, with some sort of saying it's a bit dangerous and others saying it could be sensible.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties, it's a bit like the word evangelical. People say, I'm an evangelical, and you say, well, what do you mean when you say that? And when you say, but assisted dying, people say, oh, I think it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I say, what do you mean when you say, I support or I'm opposed to voluntary assisted dying? Because I think there are so many emotional and cultural and social threads attached to it, so many strings on this, that it's really hard to get to the nub of what we're trying to clarify. And I think in the conversation that we're having, one thing I'm very conscious about is that this is an incredibly important emotional and human question, because dying, of course, and the fear of suffering is at the core of how we understand ourselves. So the question is not a distant conversation. It's actually very close to us. And for many of us, including myself, we've had close family members and close friends die, and some of them have suffered in their dying, and that's been a challenge for us. So when we have this conversation, I'm acutely aware that this is not just some academic proposition or some sort of theological conversation.
And in a sense, it's not a simplistic one either, is it? Because one of the things that is a reality is that as humans, we live so much longer, and the medical profession can keep us alive so much longer, but we don't ask the question about quality within that sometimes.
No, and I think this is part of the challenge, is that when people want to make this conversation about this piece of legislation or political or social decision here, and that's an important one. But there are so many parts to it. For example, the gift that medical science has given us about longer lives and a higher quality of life has also sort of morphed into this conversation about maintaining life at all costs. And I know plenty of GPs and specialists who are horrified by what they see as being, at all costs prolonging life. But at the same time too, when a family member comes who's clearly dying and the doctor says, how do we ease their ending? And the family say, oh, we must keep them alive at all costs. So the conversation's in that space as well as, I guess, that whole conversation around death and dying. And I know that you've talked to Ken Day about this larger question about death and dying that we haven't easily resolved. And often in the church, we find ourselves not so much playing catch up, but almost feel like catch up about ethical and moral and social issues. And this is certainly one of those.
Yeah. Because so what with the legislation, what are we talking about? We're not talking about someone picking and choosing to die whenever they want if they're fit and healthy, are we?
No, the legislation is much more constrained than that. I mean, I don't want to use biasing language, but if you're going to have a legislation around assisted dying, then what we have before us is a reasonable attempt at that. So it's trying to constrain it and make it a certain space, and it's not about some things, it is about other things. So there is, and it's considered in the light of what's happened in the other states around Australia. So this was not some sort of lone attempt to have the conversation, but it's certainly considered. And the guy who's putting it forward, Alex Greenwich from Sydney, as an independent, is an excellent guy. So his proposal is not some radical left-wing proposal. And I guess this is part of the conversation too, is that when the church has this conversation, we aren't in this churchified space where we all think the same and cordially agree. By no means, your GPs alone prove that for us. But it's a space where I think if we polled the church, whether the Uniting Church or the whole church, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see us having similar polling figures to that wider community as we do on same-gender marriage and abortion, and there are lots of other things. We have a similar kind of response, which is a majority of people seem to think that assisted dying is okay. If you ask the next question, which is, what do you mean when you say that? You enter into much heavier country.
So what about when it comes back to our faith? Because ultimately, for us, as we look at this question from a Christian perspective, it's about our faith and what we're doing here. What is the faith in relation to it? Like we've got the Catholic Church quite strongly opposed to this legislation.
Yeah.
But as a Protestant Christian or as a Christian in general, what are we looking at? What are we actually? Does Jesus say anything in the scriptures that we know of?
Well, I guess that's. I mean, if we begin, I wrote down on my notes. I wrote down the question: where does our conversation begin? And if we begin with, "Oh, my mum died a horrible death. It was painful and awful and tragic," then that's a very different place to begin. To my understanding of the gospel says we treasure all life and hold that together. So if we begin the conversation, if we're able to begin the conversation from that perspective of saying, what does the gospel say? The gospel talks about a number of things: the value of human life, each and every human life. It talks about connection and community. It talks in the wider New Testament about how we care for those who are sick and those who are ill. It talks about a number of things around that context, and that's really important. And we want to be really clear in the same breath that the Gospels, New Testament, especially the Old Testament, were written before antibiotics, before we had a whole lot of medical treatments that help people's lives be prolonged, that didn't have many interventions that we now have, all those sorts of things. So whatever the context of the New Testament, we have to also read it in the light of what we have had available to us today. So painkillers that we didn't have 2,000 years ago are available to us now. So this is part of the conversation too. And we know all that stuff, but we can't just read the Bible and go see and transplant it. But if we do say something like, well, the gospel says, how do we treasure life? One might argue that a person who's ravaged by cancer in what seems almost intolerable pain, treasuring their life, a person might argue, might be helping them to end that in gentleness and graciousness and honesty. Now, another person may well say, no, ending life at any point is just wrong. And the Catholic Church's conversation, and I want to say, is Catholic theologians and ethical theologians who are arguing this rather than just a run-of-the-mill Catholic, would argue ending any life prematurely is wrong. But if we've prolonged the life to a certain point, where does the conversation then work?
Yeah, that prolonging the life thing is a really interesting one. Like I've said to a few people in my life, realistically, if it was 100, 150 years ago, I'd be dead twice by now.
Yeah.
You know, I'm only 52, but yep. I would have packed up a few times.
Yeah.
On simple things. I'm really intrigued by your statement about the way we value life, and that a gospel value of valuing life doesn't always mean protecting it at all costs. In a sense, are we talking there about, as Christians, we don't need to fear death because we have Christ?
I mean, one of the, I think it's an Anglican prayer, a nighttime prayer is to each night when the closing prayer towards bedtime comes, we pray for a good death.
Oh.
And of course, the word euthanasia actually means good dying, good death. Now, I don't want to get into those weeds, but that's an interesting conversation to be part of too, because we are in a space where people are living. I think even my great-grandparents would have expected to live 20 to 30 years less than my children will expect to live. Yes. So, I mean, there's a huge generational shift as well. So issues like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and dementia are much more common now than they were 100 years ago. And so we're having a whole lot of conversation about what does that mean for someone who is, if I use dementia carefully, who is lost to themselves but never lost to God. What does that mean for us in terms of treasuring their life? And I'm not pretending at any point to be a medical ethicist, and I'm not, nor am I a doctor in any capacity. And my daughter, who's a doctor, would say, don't say that, Dad, just do not mention medical stuff. Walk away now. I want to say very carefully, this, I believe very firmly, is a conversation we must have with politicians, with each other, with the community. Because if I come to you, having watched my mother or father or grandparents or best friend die in pain and suffering and an awful death, then quite reasonably and realistically, I will come to this conversation passionately opposed to suffering. If I haven't had that experience, I come from a different frame. And I'm not saying good or bad, I'm saying it's a frame of fear and concern. And I don't want my mother died some 20 odd years ago, but I don't want my father to die in pain and suffering. I don't want that. So what do I do about that in terms of understanding how we care for him? I didn't say he's not crook either. He's fine.
He's going okay. Well,
he's going like a train, mate, like a train.
Yeah. One of my really good friends and their mother, who I respected deeply, like I really valued her. I spent a bit of time with her and was a lovely person. When she got considerably old, she was totally blind, largely deaf, and was a number of drugs keeping her alive in other ways as well, blood pressure, you know, as a few of us do, have a smorgasbord of tablets. And for her one day, I remember she called her family in and said, it's time for me to stop taking my tablets.
Right.
And she had the conversation with her family around, it's time for me to stop taking my tablets. And inevitably that will mean within the next week I will die.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting question for me in this. Would she fall under this legislation or not? Like it's a...
Yeah, and I think there is that sense of deliberate or or just the deliberate ending someone's life, or simply allowing it to end, is there a different space in there? And there is a different space in there very clearly. And I don't want to end this conversation before I've actually also mentioned the fact that a conversation for middle-class Anglo people is an important conversation. When you ask an Aboriginal person in this conversation, or a person from a different culture, or a Jewish person, or a person who's disabled in this space, or a person from the wider Cal community, you know, from the Islander community, then the conversation becomes a very different conversation, and we need to hear all those voices in this space. I mean, in the Synod presentation, one of the people we were talking to is a doctor in Western Sydney, does a lot of work with the Aboriginal community, and he was saying this is a very fraught conversation in the Aboriginal community, and he wasn't saying therefore we should, but he was saying we need to be paying attention to that, because one of the complications we have in the church, and we know this from our history, is that we often have imposed a way of thinking that we all think the same, and therefore, where in actual fact, you know, Kurt Fearnley has spoken was referred to in our paper for the Synod. Kurt Fearnley was told his mother was told when he was born just to leave him there, and he would quietly die. Now, how we speak into that space is once again important and engaged, and so we cannot deny the fact that we actually bring our experience and our anecdotes into this space. But in the end, if we begin from a point of view that says God treasures each and every life, if that's the primary starting block for our conversation, if we hear the gospel and say that Jesus treasured even those ones we would regard as least, whether they were women in that culture, or children, or people who were outcast or outlaws or whatever, if we did it, what does it mean, therefore, for us to treasure those lives in this day and age? What does it mean for us to hold those lives as being invaluable, especially when they are in acute suffering? And that's part of the challenge for us. And please, like I say, this conversation is emotionally invested for many, many of us, and will affect most of us in our own lives, or the lives of those we love most dearly. So that's an important reflection as well on that. Yeah.
I love that United Church of Canada creed, where it says, in life, in death, in
Yes.
life after death, God is with us, we
Yes.
are not alone.
Yes.
And so in a sense, in this whole process of, and for a person struggling with this, in life and in death and in life after death, we are not alone, we are with God.
Yeah, yeah.
God is with us through all of this, and
Yeah.
I don't think God doesn't pack up and go and say, oh, well, look, I'm not liking what you're doing there, I'm going to leave you.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, one of my favourite hymns by Brian Wren talks about, to paraphrase it, we are never forgotten. Whatever the life after death is, we are never forgotten by God. Our lives are hid with Christ in God, which I think is really important. It's interesting in talking about this too with the Dying with Dignity crowd, and they were really two doctors, a legal person, and an advocate, who were all excellent, faithful people and engaging in the conversation. They said to me, in jurisdictions where legislation like this one being proposed has been allowed, many people who have advocated for it have then not taken the option, but just having the option available to them has given them a sense of peace and calm, and they've then moved into palliative care, which I want to say is part of this conversation too. If we do improve palliative care, if we do put money into the right places medically and socially, and not politically, but consult with doctors and specialists and how do we do that, then I think there is a space in there where we are reducing the pressure of this question. I mean, at its depth, part of this problem with this question is that for many, this is a question about wealth. If you have enough resource financially, you can ease your suffering more than a person who doesn't have those resources. I know in Australia that sounds appalling. It is appalling. But if we're able to address this as I said, there are a series of issues in this conversation, and one of them is the level of, if we provided resources more effectively for palliative care and for medical care, then the conversation would be once again have a different colour to it.
We probably need to wrap up, although I would love to talk about this for a few hours.
Yes.
Love to is probably the wrong term, but I'm intrigued by the conversation. So if we were to actually bring it back, in a sense, we can't say yes, no, or this is what the church's opinion is, because the church's opinion is we're forming this opinion.
Yeah, and we need to speak into the conversation. I'm talking to politicians right now. We need to talk about how we value human life. We need to talk about how we understand God, being in God's image. We need to understand what that means, but that can't just simply mean a blatant conversation where we say any drawing to an end of life, because if we just say drawing someone's life to an end is immediately wrong. We don't understand that our body is actually being honoured. If our body is actually dying, if it's actually dying, and I mean that medically, if the doctor says to us, this person's body is dying, what's it mean for us to draw that to a close? What's it mean for us to medicate? What's it mean for us to engage in that conversation in a way that respects what the body is doing?
And from a Christian perspective, we are not ending a life. We are ending an existence as a human on earth at this point in time. But life, our faith would tell us in life, in death, in life after death.
Yeah.
God is with us.
What worries me, and this is always the conversation, is the slippery slope argument. I mean, one of my conversations has been, who would define the suffering and pain from cancer as being better or worse than the suffering and pain from extreme schizophrenia? Now, I would never want to qualify those two, but we've excluded mental health in this legislation entirely.
Yes.
Now, which I think is probably appropriate, but who gets to decide what suffering is? And once again, suffering is an incredibly fraught conversation. And we live in a society which is seeking at all costs to end suffering, it seems to me, especially if you have the resources to cope with that. But how we hold human life, and if we attend to the gospel, and if we need to attend to the gospel, the ones who are regarded as least are elevated as the most in the gospel. The ones who are last are told they'll be first. The ones who are regarded as outcast are gathered in. The cross tells us that Christ died on the cross as an outcast, so that all those who are outcasts are actually known that they are welcome. So what does that mean for us in having this conversation? And of course, none of these is a simplistic answer, nor should it be, but it's incredibly important to have this conversation in the light of that gospel, rather than just the one that says, thou shalt not kill. That's important too, but there are more threads to this story than just simply quoting one of the 10 Commandments.
Yes. So for the person that's asked the question, I think I would want to say, sorry, we can't say yes, no. Here's the simple answer.
Yeah.
But we really want to say we need to look at the edges of this conversation and bring our faith to all of that, acknowledging that God is with us in the midst of this, and that we need to hold God's love for a person and God's mercy for a person in the midst of this. And that doesn't actually just mean saying no or saying yes, but looking at it in a bigger way. Is that?
Yeah, and I think, and if we take the word suffering as carefully as we can, if part of that person's suffering can be reduced by care and connection and some medication, if that can be part of that story, a person being valued and loved, does that help the conversation for that person? I don't know the answer to that, but it would seem to me that a person who is alone, a person who's in significant pain, but which could be reduced, if we can address those two things, then we're having a different conversation than from someone who is knowing they have resources available to deal with the pain they have. I mean, the reality is I've been with people, a lot of people have died, a lot of people have died. Some have died uncomfortably, many have died at peace with themselves and the world. A lot of their suffering has been relational suffering, which has doubled their physical suffering. And how we address all those things as part of this conversation. But let me be really clear. I see my task as moderator, my task to engage in conversation with politicians in the church, that we might together work this thing through more fully.
Simon, I really want to thank you for this. challenging topic.
Mm.
Yeah. And at the moment, you're locked down in Tamworth while we're locked down here on the Central Coast.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And and it's interesting to me right now for people who are dying with COVID, they die alone.
Yeah.
And I talk to doctors and nurses who grieve every time that happens. And I think to myself, this is the thing we're talking about. This is about the human condition, about suffering of dying alone, not just the one who is dying, but those who would be in that room in a heartbeat if they could.
Yes.
And they can't be there. And I think we have a lot to learn about how we care for each other. And part of that lies at the heart of the gospel.
Thank you so much, Simon. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Richard. Blessings to all you folk at Terrigal, and thank you. That's our person for that question.